Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Craig Roepke, Pleasant Prairie Fire Chief. Welcome.
Greetings, glad to be here. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for talking with me. When did you start with the department?
I started with the Pleasant Prairie Fire Department, then the town of Pleasant Prairie, back in May of 1982.
And how old were you at the time?
I just turned 18.
Good. Why did you decide to volunteer with the fire department?
It was one of those activities that in a lot of ways made you feel good about what you were doing. A lot of folks have a kind of a stereotypical response, like they just wanted to help people. It was one of those jobs or hobbies at the time where it was just a fun thing to do. Granted, that those activities we responded to situations where people were having a bad day, but it still had that element of I'll say action, or sometimes surprise, or you had to solve a problem. And that was typically in the fire service, we're problem solvers. We're presented with a lot of different issues and we have to solve those problems.
And what was your job when you began with the department?
So back in 1982, the fire department and the rescue squad were still separate functions, unlike today. So a member had an option of being either a firefighter or an EMT or both. And for myself, I was both on the fire department and on the rescue squad.
Okay. And in terms of full-time people, or who operated the two stations, who did the department have?
So the town of Pleasant Prairie, ironically, always had a full-time staff. Now, that staff at that time only consists of one member at each station. So, the staff was very, I'll say, thin, and because of the fact that they did rely, back then on truly volunteers to respond to calls and such.
And how many volunteers were there when you joined the department?
If I recall correctly, there were probably around 45, 50 members.
Okay. And were most of them EMS people?
A lot of the, and I don't know if it was, gender centric back then, but a lot of the men were more on the fire side, and we had a lot of females, women that were kind of also on the rescue squad. So it wasn't very, I guess, integrated. We did have folks like myself that were on both sides.
Okay. And what the equipment were at the two stations at the time you joined?
So back then, fire apparatus were all manual transmission, where you had to know how to drive a manual transmission truck. And, it had the high and low range, and you had to be able to drive manual transmission in order to operate the vehicle. So, basically they're very similar to what we have today, but very rudimentary. As far as the ambulances, they were all Dodge Econoline van type of ambulances that ran typically on sometimes gasoline or diesel. But you had to know how to drive manual transmission.
How many drivers were there in the department?
As I recall, there were probably at least 15 to 18 drivers. Again, because of the fact that if you didn't know how to drive manual transmission, you couldn't be a driver.
You didn't have to be a driver if you knew how to drive a manual transmission, though.
Right. Being a driver was not a requirement, because the bulk of the work, or the workload, if you will, was the moving of hose and typical firefighting operations.
Okay. So each station had what equipment, how were they outfitted?
So typically each station had an ambulance, had one ambulance, had a grass truck, which was typically an old Army type Jeep vehicle that was converted with a pump and a certain size water tank, so that it could go off road. And then in addition to that, each station had a tanker, that would carry larger amounts of water, say, 1,700 to 2,000 gallons of water. And then each station had a fire pumper or a fire engine that specifically the job was to pump water.
Well, basically, there were 4 pieces of equipment, including an ambulance at each station.
And so basically what would happen is that whoever was on duty at the time, they would take the most appropriate, whether it's a fire call or EMS call, they would take the most appropriate piece. And if it was a fire, as an example, people would come to the station and take a tanker or the engine until all the apparatus was gone out of the station.
Okay. So tell me about a call back then. Somebody calls dispatch. There was somebody as a dispatcher at each station, or? No,
the dispatch came out of our station number 2 at the time. And what happened is that there was a fire line. You'd have a fire, people would, before 911, you would dial 694-1402, and you would dial that number, and it would ring at both stations. And you always had to wait for 2 rings. You waited for 2 rings, and then each station would pick up. And that literally was, on the other end of the phone, was the person, the citizen, or the resident, needing some type of service. And from that point on, that's how things got dispatched.
Okay, and then the dispatch is there. How do the volunteers respond? Do they show up at the station? Do they go to a scene? How does that work?
So the response was somewhat mixed. So once the dispatch was able to generate certain tones over the radio, which triggered home alert receivers, if you were close to the station, you would go to the station to pick up a piece of apparatus, whether a fire truck or a pumper, a tanker. But if you're closer to the scene or closer to the incident, you were supposed to go to that incident. So then, basically what would happen is that people close to the station pick up the rig, take it to the station, and then the people that were closer to the scene would already be there. And your crew was essentially assembled at wherever the scene was.
Okay, and how did the volunteers know that there was a call?
So they had these home alert receivers. They were really before the age of, we didn't have pagers as you know them today. They were these large alert receivers that made this god-awful loud alert noise. I mean, you could literally hear it probably anywhere in the house. And typically you would have them by your bedside. They were very, very loud. And they just put out a very loud beep. And after the beep, the dispatcher would get on the radio and say, you have a fire call at this address. And, knowing where you were located, you would either go to the station or go to the scene.
Okay, and where was the turnout gear for each of the volunteers?
So each member carried the turnout gear in their own personal vehicle. So, that was at a time, we don't do that today. Most places don't do that today. As we learned more and become smarter, with the hazards of smoke and different carcinogens, the turnout gear is not supposed to be kept in the personal vehicles anymore in current day.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go back to your particular jobs. What was the EMT basic person allowed to do? What was their responsibilities, their training?
So EMT basic back then was, I'll say, very kind of rudimentary. I mean, it was very basic first aid, splinting, and really more trauma related, not really more illness, medical or cardiac related as we do today. So the skill sets for an EMT basic, back in the early 80s, was very contained. You didn't get to do a lot of advanced skill sets or things as such.
And what was in the ambulances?
So again, we had a lot of splinting or padded wooden boards for splinting of like legs and arms. A lot of bandage material. We had saline for burns and things like that. But as far as medications, we really had none. We used to carry activated charcoal for somebody who might have been overdosing, and again, that was probably one of the very few things that we could do invasively, to give somebody something. Other than that, it was very exterior, bandaging, things like that. So we didn't do anything really invasive.
And how did that change?
So like with a lot of things, as time marches on, and one of the things that I can always say about the town, now village, that we always wanted to be very progressive. We wanted to kind of, what's the next thing? And so as part of that, the current standards were what they refer to as EMT Basic. They started looking at this program called EMTD, or EMT defibrillator. And it was the concept of EMTs would carry defibrillators, just as you see on TV. And depending upon certain criteria or cardiac rhythm, they would defibrillate a patient. And so there was additional schooling, additional licensing, and now we started into the whole concept of medical direction by a physician, which was really a new concept for us under the EMT Basic rules.
So as the EMS services expanded and more things were able to be done, was there any reaction, resistance against some of the changes that you were allowed to do as an EMT?
I think in one word answer, no. The folks that were on the department, by and large, wanted to progress. They wanted to do more. Some of those folks were the women were like nurses, and they saw what was going on in the hospitals, and I think just overall we knew that in a back then in a rural community, it's like we weren't really making an impact, as far as what they refer now as pre-hospital medicine, but we never referred it to back then as pre-hospital medicine. And so anything that we could do to really, if you will, up our game or increase our skill set, we wanted to try that out. And fortunately, the town, again at that time, town administration was very on board in looking at how can we up our game, increase our skill set. Now, an interesting point, the medical directors or the physicians that were controlling this obviously were on board, but you also had some ER physicians at the time that, thought that having an EMT defibrillate in the field was way too much of an advanced skill to be happening in the field, and that should be just for ER physicians in the emergency rooms.
Okay, and how did the outfitting of the ambulance change when you became an EMT defibrillator?
So by and large, it fairly stayed the same. Really the major addition was that defibrillation unit, that defibrillator model that had the screen, or the little oscilloscope screen where you could see the heart rhythm. And we also, because of the program was kind of a pilot program at the time, we had to have this secondary module or device that recorded the voice and recorded the cardiac tracings, so that after the call it could be reviewed and kind of critiqued on did everything happen correctly, did we do everything the way we were supposed to do. And specifically technically wise, it was a LifePak 5 unit that was almost, I want to say, about 3 foot long, because each module added a little bit of more width to it. So it was quite the contraption if you compare today the modern equipment that we have.
Okay, and again, the EMS services expanded and got more complex.
So yeah, so in 1986 we started that EMTD program, and then shortly thereafter, I believe 87, 88, they introduced this concept of EMT intermediate. Okay, what we know today as paramedic, it was somewhere intermediate, was kind of in between a paramedic and an EMT basic, and that really introduced the concept of allowing us to provide intravenous fluids, essentially IVs, and we were able to give 50% dextrose, or D50 as they call it, for folks in diabetic crisis with low blood sugar, and that was really started to make that difference where we could create and start doing some of those interventions that you could really see a positive outcome immediately, where a patient was unconscious because of a low blood sugar. You start that IV, you give them that sugar, and really before your eyes, that person would regain consciousness. So that was really the start of seeing some definitive, cause and effect.
Okay, and what was the next step after that?
So we did intermediate for probably 2 to 3 years, and as things were progressing around the county, around the state, the city of Kenosha, in I believe it was 1990, started the paramedic program, their paramedic program, and they did a wonderful job in bringing that program to the city and providing paramedic level service. And during that time, we started looking at that and saying, wow, wouldn't that be great if we could tag onto that program, and the now village of Pleasant Prairie, Pleasant Prairie incorporated or became a village in 1989. So 1990, now the village, the administration, the membership was like, how could we really become a part of that? Because we thought that the residents deserve that type of level of pre-hospital care as well. And a lot of times people didn't discern, are you in the village or are you in the city? Because sometimes those borders were kind of intermingled. And so we worked with the state to kind of find out what the requirements were. And back then, the requirements to have a paramedic system were very stringent. There was a minimum population for that community. You had to commit to doing certain things, and there was also a cost factor in providing, equipment and medications and training and continuing education and such. So, that was really one of the things that, was kind of had to be really sought out and researched, because, we're, by no means the size of the city of Kenosha, but yet we wanted to kind of try to provide that same level of service.
Okay, and all this while you advanced along with the EMS services growing?
So yeah, so the the number of full-time folks increased, within the village. Our call volume started to go up. We continued with the intermediate program, kind of, scoping out, if you will, what would it take and how feasible would it be to become a paramedic level system. And we lobbied with the state EMS office and kind of tried to demonstrate to them that historically over the years that Pleasant Prairie was a progressive organization, with the advent of EMT basic, with the EMTD defibrillation program, with EMT intermediate. And I don't recall the exact details, but we were able to lobby successfully that although we didn't have the population count, because the adjacent city was next door, and the village administration committed to providing the funding and the training and the equipment, that we were able to actually become a paramedic level system.
And you trained to each higher level as they came.
Yeah, so I was actually in the first village paramedic class in 1991, and that's really when we started, probably late '91, in the paramedic program. And it's interesting, as part of our clinical ride-alongs, we actually rode with the city of Kenosha in their rescue squads and ambulances as part of our training program. And being adjacent, we knew a lot of the individuals and such, as far as that were already paramedics. So it was a great collaboration, as far as to be able to kind of work alongside the folks that we've already known for years.
Okay, and when the town became a village, how did the fire department in total change with that shift in government?
Well, I think from a trajectory perspective, I mean, we were kind of well on our way already. I mean, from the town to the village. We spoke about how the police department had grown, but the fire department was working to grow really in a staffing capacity. And there were limitations, from a funding perspective, on how we could grow from a full-time. And we were also, quite honestly and unfortunately, we were losing our paid on-call people. We've always maintained our regimented training requirements, and we've, based on even our history of progressive training, which was probably also a bullet point that allowed the state EMS office to allow us to go to paramedic. So we were always very training regimented. So as we continued that training idea, we kind of lost some of our paid on-call staff. Back in the early years, being a volunteer, being a paid on-call member was somewhat of a casual event. There was not a regimented schedule. You didn't have to commit to, hey, I'm going to be on call every week. As we became a village, we recognized that we had to be more regimented in our training. We had to be more regimented in our scheduling, because we were becoming a paramedic level system, and as part of that requirement, you had to have 2 paramedics on the ambulance, at all time.
Okay. And during this first 10 years of you being involved, you were still a volunteer.
I was still a volunteer, although that volunteer definition had really morphed into a paid on call, which really refers to the fact that you get paid a certain amount for every call that you go on. And then additionally, we started to really ramp up the what we refer to as the part-time. So obviously you're not full-time, you work in the station on a regular shift, and you do that on somewhat of a regular basis. So we had both part-time and paid on-call members.
Describe to me how training in the fire department, not only in the EMS section, but also as firefighters, how did the training change from when you first started as a volunteer to that first 10-year period and when paramedic system came into effect?
So the training was more regimented, as different, techniques and knowledge came to be. We had, we always had breathing apparatus, or they refer to them as SCBA. It's the big tank on your back, and a lot of time there's a misnomer that it's an oxygen tank, where really it's just regular breathing air that we compress out of the ambient air. But we, as technology moved forward, we were fortunate enough where we could continue with that technology, where the improved breathing apparatus, the improved apparatus, even the improved type of garments, the turnout gear that we wore. I mean, the original turnout gear was really what they referred to as a 3/4 coat and 3/4 boots. Now we had, a lot more advanced turnout gear that had a thermal layer and had more of a protective outer durable shell. We had what they refer to as bunker pants, where it's basically, pants that you put on and your jacket kind of fits over that a little bit. So, we were always looking at the new thing, and fortunately, we were always provided with the funding to do that. So that was clearly a benefit.
Okay, so that first year of you being a member of the fire department, what kind of training did you go through on a regular basis?
So a lot of the training, way back when in the early '80s was hose movement, getting the trucks out there, practicing connecting the tanker to the engine, because back then our water system, the fire hydrants, the town was still a very rural area, and with the exception of areas that were closer to the city that utilized some of the Kenosha water system, most of Pleasant Prairie was all rural. So if we needed water, we had to bring that with us, and we had to practice. So a lot of our fire training involved practicing setting up what we referred to as a porta tank, which is really just more of a small swimming pool that the tankers would dump the water into, and we would what referred to as draft or suck the water out of those small swimming pools. And so we often practice doing that and hooking up lines and practice pumping.
And did you practice once a week? Did you practice weekends?
Typically it was once a week, and our training nights were Tuesday evenings at 7 o'clock. And because again, most if not all of the membership had daytime jobs, and by the time they got home, had dinner, would get to the station. So Tuesday nights were our standard training nights.
Okay. And you had a daytime job?
I did have a daytime job. My first, when I started, I was actually still going to college at UW Parkside and for computer science. So that was quote unquote my daytime job. And until 1986, when I graduated, started my first full-time job at the Medical College of Wisconsin doing MIS, or Management Information Systems, which now we know commonly as IT today.
Okay, and how long did you work there?
So Medical College of Wisconsin, I was there for 3 years, and then subsequently I was able to get a position at Snap-on Tools right here in Kenosha, which all while I'm still on the fire department, being a part-time paid-on-call member, which for me was actually beneficial because, during the day, if there was a large incident, I had the type of job and the type of management that allowed me to go to the call during the day, which was a huge benefit. And actually, I had a colleague that worked at Snap-on as well that was on the fire department as well. So, as time marched on, we were everybody knew in the office that we were on the fire department together, and that we would go on calls during the day if it was of large enough. I mean, the typical med calls or EMS calls, we wouldn't go on because they weren't to the degree high enough where they needed the personnel.
And then how did training change? How did you have to train more often? Did you have to?
So training continued once a week, on a Tuesday nights, and then as the paid-on-call staff, as that ratio to paid-on-call staff and part-time staff and full-time staff kind of changed, right? We lost our part-time folks and we gained our full-time folks. We had to make a determination at some point in time, where we had, say only 10 part-time people or paid-on-call, and the majority of our full-time staff were, let's say, 24 full-time, does it really make sense to maintain that Tuesday night level training? And, and I forget exactly when. It was probably in the, the early, or the 2012s or 2011s, where we really had to make a decision to say, we're no longer going to maintain that Tuesday night type of training idea where we're going to change from Tuesday night to on-shift training. Because again, the full-time members, they work 24 on, 48 off. So everything we really do in the fire service is in threes. We basically do the same type of training topic 3 times a week so that we can cover all our training folks. So that really kind of put a a damper on the part-time and paid-on-call staff. There were a couple members that had flexibility enough that they could come during the day, but that was really very few.
Okay, and as the town became a village, how did the full-time staff change at the fire department initially?
So initially, the full-time staff, they always did work their 24/48s. We had some other shifts, 12-hour shifts, and what they refer to as 24/24 shifts that a few people worked, but by and large, the bulk of the full-time staff worked 24/48. The early days, we still utilized the paid-on-call staff where we only put one person in a fire truck, the full-time individual, where the full-time individual would get the fire truck, go to the scene, and the staff and the paid-on-call staff would meet them at the scene. Later on in the mid 2015s, 2016s, we really had to look at that as far as is it appropriate to put one person in a fire truck, because of safety and just effectiveness. I recall one time where we had a car fire and we were just returning from a fire alarm, and we had 3 fire trucks on the road, but each fire truck only had one person in it. And so we had to respond 3 fire trucks to the one car fire because we needed the staff. So it was really very overkill in one manner, but we needed the staff to respond. And
so in 1989, how many full-time fire department personnel was there
there were probably 6
at that time?
because again, 2 stations, 3 shifts, and only one person on each shift.
Okay. And how did that change, let's say 10 years after that? What kind of per full-time?
So we probably had, if I recall correctly, we probably went from like 6 to 10 to where, or 10 to 12, where you could put 2 full-time people at each station, each shift. So it progressively got better, but it really didn't get to a point to where we could staff an ambulance and an engine out of each station. So like, for example, if there was a car accident, you'd have the engine go from one station and the ambulance go from the other. And then the paid-on-call staff would meet them at the scene. One of the key things to really bring up that we always had a 3-member ambulance. The national standard is typically 2, okay? So if you recall, you have to have 2 paramedics. But we've always put 3 members on an ambulance. We've always felt that provides the best level of care. If you think about it, if you have only 2 members, when you transport to the hospital, 1 member has to drive, so that only leaves 1 member in the back to take care of the patient. And depending upon the level of issues or problems or sickness or injuries, that one person is really being taxed to provide, halfway decent care. And we never believed that you could provide good patient care with 2 people in the ambulance.
When did you start full-time?
I actually started full-time in September of 2009. Many refer to as a latecomer, if you will. Obviously, I've been on the department for many years and very much involved, and quite honestly, there's many village staff that because I was around so much, they just assumed I was full-time, prior to 2009. But through a series of events and the downturn in 2008, there were layoffs in the couple different jobs that I had, and an opportunity arose where Chief Paul Gilbert at the time had an opening, and he said, I know you're an IT guy, but you've been here for a very long time, and you meet all the qualifications as a paramedic and such. If you want the job, it's yours. You can start on Monday. And so I gave it some thought, and Monday morning I reported to work as a full-time member.
And at that time, how many full-time members were in the department? Now, this is almost 25 years, not quite, 20 years after you started.
Yeah, so again, 2009, we probably had around 21 members, if I recall correctly.
That were full-time?
They were full-time. So,
And the equipment pretty much outfitted at each station was the same?
yeah, and that remains the same today for the most part. You know, you typically have a brush or grass truck, you have an ambulance, you have a fire engine, and a pumper or tanker. That pretty much remains similar today. Some of the variation with that is that we have an aerial platform truck that sits out at Station 2. And we have another ladder at Station 1. The platform and the ladder, what we refer to as a straight stick, because it's just a ladder at the end. They have some different functions, but primarily they're the same. So we pretty much have similar equipment at each station.
Okay, and with the fire department personnel, you have designated drivers today as opposed to maybe prior?
We do. We have so one of the differences in our department, where everybody's required to be able to drive. So from a qualification perspective, you need to be able to become what they refer to as a motor pump operator or MPO, or I think you referred to it as an apparatus operator. You need to have the knowledge and the skill set to be able to drive the truck. Our staffing is such that we can't rely on only a certain subset of folks to be able to drive, because we have to be nimble. We have to be able to zig and zag, if you will, as far as the staffing goes. So everybody has the ability to drive. Usually now in current day, there's usually an assigned driver for the day for that piece of apparatus. And that just helps kind of organize the crew for the day as far as who's going to be doing what.
Okay. And I assume that the driver is not just driving the equipment. They have other responsibilities.
So that's a great question. And then one of the misnomers, just from a public perspective, is that that individual does much more than drive. They're responsible for that piece of apparatus, that vehicle. And that vehicle nowadays is probably your typical fire truck is probably just under $1 million. Ladder truck is definitely $1 million plus nowadays. And you look at it at face value, and how can it be $1 million? How can it be $900,000? They're very complex mechanical and electronic devices now. Just in your own car, as you see all the electronics that go into a vehicle today, you can probably double or triple that in a fire apparatus. You need to know how that vehicle functions. You need to know what's in every compartment. You need to understand, in every compartment what piece of equipment is in there, and you need to be able to operate that piece of equipment. The fire pump itself, you need to be able to know how to operate that pump, because you now are distributing the water to the different hoses. And you also need to understand when things don't go right, you need to be able the ability to troubleshoot what could possibly be the problem and how to correct it. So it's a monumental task that I think gets overlooked. When people look at, hey, you're just driving a fire truck, and so therefore our driver qualification process is very involved, so folks should take great pride in if you're an apparatus operator, you've made an accomplishment.
And are there a lot of gauges and dials that have to be watched?
There is. I mean, there's a lot of, the cliche, there's a lot of moving parts. I mean, you have to monitor, what water is coming in, what water is coming in, because if, you can only put as much water out that you have coming in. So you have to be careful about not, if you will, creating a vacuum in the fire hydrant or the water system, to be able to suck too much water out of that fire hydrant, because that fire hydrant will only supply so much water. And so, you may need to attach a second hydrant. You may need a second fire engine. So, the gauges, the dials, the foam, the firefighting foam that we use to help suppress a fire, you need to understand it, what certain percentages, so, there's probably at least, 9 to 10 different outlets that the water can leave the fire truck from. Each one of those outlets have gauges. You need to understand pressure versus gallons per minute versus flow. So, that operator really needs to be on their toes. They need to have very much situational awareness about, where their water is coming from, what their hose lines are. From a safety perspective, if you have firefighters inside an active fire in a structure, you need those fire hoses, become not charged. Essentially the water's not flowing. It's a significant, safety issue. So that person is a significant participant in that firefighting team. Hence the reason why, that person, that apparatus operator, is essentially glued to the truck. I mean, they are not to leave the truck. They can manage around what the truck is, but it's not that they set the dials and go off and fight the fire inside, because that leaves the fire truck unattended. And based on what the conditions might be, you could lose water, and that's very dangerous if you have people inside. So firefighting is a very dynamic operation. It's constantly changing, and that crew, that apparatus operator, really need to be reading the scene.
Today you're the chief. How did that come about?
How did that come about? First off, I'm very fortunate to be the chief of the organization. The people that we have are marvelous. They're smart. They're very capable, and we're lucky to have them. During my whole time as a paid-on-call, I rose to the rank of captain as a paid-on-call, so throughout that, when I became full-time in 2009, I went back to being a standard line firefighter, because it kind of is a little bit different full-time versus paid-on-call. And so as part of the process, you needed to be on the job at least 3 years before you could apply to being a lieutenant. So I think it was 3 years and a few months, and there was a position for assistant chief. And because of my tenure as a paid-on-call and becoming a captain and such, the administration allowed me to apply for the position of assistant chief back in late 2011. So went through that process and was appointed assistant chief in 2012 under then Chief Doug McElmurray, and basically was assistant chief for 5 years up until 2017 when Chief McElmurray retired. The position for chief went out both internal and external to different candidates. I threw my hat in the ring, and between Police and Fire Commission and the Village Board, I was appointed chief of the department in June of 2017.
And as of June 2017, what was the status of the full-time staff in the fire department?
So back then, I think we had a few more members. I think we had 24 or 26 members. And again, we still only put one person on a fire truck because we still had a cadre still had some paid-on-call folks. But we were getting better. We'd occasionally put 2 people on a fire truck because we had more full-time staff. And we were able to do, like 3 people on a shift, so per station. And that was what we referred to as the minimum staffing. And our call volume as well rose up, and but I think probably one of the significant, lobbying, if you will, was that of staffing. Because really staffing was, in my mind, in my opinion, was the predominant issue of that we needed more staff.
And what was the first, or one of the first things you did when you became chief?
So one of the things I did is I created an internal document that really highlighted, statistically based on history, our increasing call volume, our increasingly use of mutual aid for daily use. One of the things regarding mutual aid is really intended for those large events, right? So some sort of catastrophic, explosion or fire, where you just don't have the resources to maintain that type of catastrophic event. We were using mutual aid on a daily basis, for that standard everyday calls where, really that really is not the intent of mutual aid. We were utilizing the city of Kenosha and their med units on a pretty routine basis to handle our second or third call type of environment where, we would receive a call, we'd handle it. We'd receive a second call, we'd handle it. Now we'd get a third call. We just didn't have any resources left, people, in the fire service and first responders, you just don't wait until something becomes available. You need to be able to respond in a timely manner. So that's where we started utilizing, the city of Kenosha. We also used, then the town of Bristol, actually the village of Bristol, village of Summers, and area agencies to help fill that gap.
Okay, there was, as you became chief, one person per truck. Did you change that?
So I did, and that was a little bit of controversy, because that really changed the available staffing, that was needed. And we moved to the model of having 3 people on a fire truck. And, that did a couple things. That immediately made us a little thinner from a staffing perspective. But it also, in my mind, from a safety perspective, it ensured that we had a good complement of people that could handle the problem with one piece of apparatus. We didn't have to send multiple pieces to the one incident. We were able to take one piece of apparatus, like a car fire as an example. We could send one engine to a car fire and take care of business or take care of the problem, where previous we would have to send like 2 engines. So, and that was a little bit of controversy because it did change the staffing model a little bit, and kind of getting back to that internal document that was shared internally with staff and administration. It really gave a summary of we need more staffing, we need Station 3. And because statistically, we're doing more calls, and statistically, I could demonstrate that we're utilizing mutual aid on a daily basis. And so, as a result of that, administration said, well, we need to do a staffing study. We need a consultant to come in and kind of tell us or guide us the fact that what you're saying is factual. And it was a little disheartening, but I also understood that if we were to move down the path of a referendum, that there would need some substantiation of claim that we do need these additional resources.
And you had requested, or you learned or presented in your internal document, an increase of how many people?
So we increased, I believe it was 14, I think the number, 12 or 14 is the number. And that just really, if you did the simple math of, if you have, 3 as a basis of a crew, right? Whether that's in an ambulance or whether that's in an engine, 3 is your basis. And so based on that, 14 is really the number, in addition to the number that we had, was the number that we really needed.
And the consultant's report, what did that present?
The consultant's report collaborated, what was indicated, and again, that was, I would be lying if I told you that I didn't have a little bit of satisfaction, but it was good that they collaborated on that outcome, because it really kind of opened the way up for a broader discussion about we really need to solve the staffing problem. As a growing community, as the call volume increases, as our development increases, the expectation of some of these larger entities and businesses that come in, they expect to have a staffed fire department. If they're going to commit millions of dollars to bring their businesses to this location, I think that was one of their many expectations.
So the consultant's report was presented to the village board in what year?
I believe it was fall of 2019. So fall of 2019, they presented to the village board their findings that, based on their data, based on their interviews, based on the information that they gathered, that additional staffing was required, that a Station 3 was warranted, and that was the information presented.
What was the next step for the village?
So that was quite honestly a challenge, because the village, from a funding perspective, and legitimately just didn't have the funds to support such a vast increase in staffing from the fire side, and really there was only one solution, and that was referendum. So we spent a lot of time organizing our thoughts, creating documents, creating statistics, based on what we've already had, charts and just information that we could convey to the residents of why we need this additional staffing.
And once this was, okay, first of all, the referendum was for fire staffing and the Station 3?
So that was kind of a common misnomer. So one of the concerns of residents were, we don't want to have to fund staffing and a building. So the building was never part of the referendum. That building was a separate funding entity, through bonds and such and borrowing. We had to make it very clear, with a lot of clarity, that the referendum is strictly for staffing.
And it was staffing in the fire department, or?
Well, we also, because it's not really part of this discussion, but on a parallel event, the police department as well, suffered from some staffing challenges. Now, not as great as the fire department did. If historically the police department added staff a little bit more regularly than the fire side did, but that said, the police department was still understaffed. So that was an opportunity. You don't want to have two separate referendums, so the decision was made to do one referendum for 12 fire staff and 4 police officers.
Okay, and the cost of this referendum, the cost of doing this was?
So the cost for doing the referendum of the 12 of 4 was calculated at $1.6 million, which which is a pretty hefty referendum, and it's a big ask. From our research, a lot of the referendums that you see in the area and around the state, you may have 3 individuals, maybe 4, but we were looking for 16, and that was a huge ask, from our residents. And you have to think about it too, the mix of business to residents in the village is about 50-50. So from a tax-based perspective, from what I understand from our assessing department, is that we're very unique in the piece that our tax base is almost split 50-50. Okay, but you also have to understand that businesses don't vote. Okay, businesses don't get a vote. They basically, the votes really come down to the residents. So it was a big ask, and so we really made a huge effort to, and selfishly, I think we did a good job of it. I mean, we wanted to really inform the residents, so we put up multiple listening sessions where residents could come in on an evening and we would present our data and the reasons why, and it gave the residents opportunities to ask questions. And a lot of those questions did bring up the Station 3 funding in the building, and we were able to bring with some clarity, that separation where, this is strictly a staffing referendum.
And when did the referendum take place?
April of 2022.
Okay. And was it successful?
It was successful. So, for us, it was a very happy moment because that we knew that those things could move on. However, I will tell you that it was a 51% approval, 48% did not approve. So there was only a 2% difference. And a lot of times we talk about thanking the residents for approving the referendum, but I think we also have to do that with caution because we had 48% of the population that said they didn't want it. So again, selfishly, I'm glad it happened. It allowed the organization to add staff and move forward, which I think that is needed, to provide good service, and so we're well on our way.
Okay, so today, have you filled all your positions?
We have not, and now becomes the next really dilemma of what I attribute a little bit to post-pandemic, workforce availability. This job, and I think with many jobs, as you talk around with employers across the state and across the country, is finding good people that want to work, and there is a lot of opportunity out there. People can do a lot of different type of jobs and get paid, a very fair and decent wage. A lot of folks can work from home and make the same wage. This sort of job is one that you really got to want to do, and you really got to like the job, and the people that we have, love the job that they're doing. They get up in the morning and they love to come to the job, which in some cases, is not as common as you might think. And so we do have, as I recall, I think we have 8 open positions left. And, we struggle to find people that want to go to paramedic school, go to firefighter, school and work that schedule. The people that do want to do it, love it. And they love every aspect of it. Again, a little cliche-ish, but they love helping people on when they're having a bad day. They love problem solving, as I mentioned earlier. Firefighters are essentially problem solvers. We're presented with any number of given issues or problems or circumstances, and it's our responsibility and obligation to solve that problem.
What is your division of pure firefighters versus paramedics, or are they still pretty much everybody?
So in today's fire service, most departments, everybody does everything. So for instance, you're a firefighter and you're a paramedic. We refer to them as fire medics, kind of in short. One day you could be riding the engine, the other day you could be on the ambulance. If you're on the engine and all of a sudden we need a paramedic, we'll pull you off the engine to do those sort of jobs. So larger departments, they typically will segregate. Well, you're only a firefighter or you're only a paramedic. They have the ability because of staffing numbers to do that. We, again, as I mentioned earlier, we need to retain that flexibility and that nimbleness to be able to move people, back and forth from the EMS side to the fire side as those situations present itself.
And when you became chief, how has today the equipment needs changed? Are you still using the same equipment you were using in 1990? Have you had to increase equipment? Have you had to replace aged out equipment?
We've been very, very fortunate to have very modernized fire equipment and EMS equipment. In regards to how the job works, we're still using water to put on fire. I mean, just as they did, decades and decades ago. So in essence, the way we put out a fire with water remains the same. The methodologies we use to put the fire out have changed and will continue to change. How we attack the fire. Do we start on the unburned side or burned side? Do we start from the outside, work our way inside, and referring to a transitional attack? Those methods are ever changing. And one of the things that I like about our organization and about our people is that they're always looking to figure out what's the next best way. And that reflects in the tools that we use, and the ways that we train, and even on the EMS side, the type of diagnostic equipment that really is part of our cardiac monitor. It's kind of a one big electronic box that can do many different things. We can measure carbon monoxide, for somebody who might be having a carbon monoxide event. We never did that years ago. So between technology and the desire to stay at the kind of the forefront, those are the way things have changed. The way we treat a patient, the way we want to care for a patient from a compassionate perspective, that always has remained the same. Our goal, our mission is to be able to get in front of someone and when they're having a bad day, and we may not be able to undo what was done, but our challenge and our mission is to really try to make that situation better as best we can and as best we are able.
And Station 3?
Station 3, it's, again, as I tell, we just had 2 new recruits start yesterday, and as I mentioned, it's really a great time to be with this organization. We're in the process of building Fire Station number 3, which is going to be located at the Prairie Springs Park on Turwell Terrace, and that will really change the dynamics of how we operate as an organization. Not only will that change some of the response stations as far as what goes where, like for instance to a McDonald's out on the interstate, obviously Station 3 will now go to that, but that'll change the dynamics of how we interact our stations as far as what remains available if we have a multi-station response. So that will just further enhance our capabilities, and it'll be very interesting. We're trying to demonstrate and we're trying to utilize new technologies even in the construction of the station by utilizing solar. There'll be a huge array of solar panels on Station 3 that estimate to have a 7 to 9 year payback, but it'll support about 60% of our electric needs. So that in itself will be huge, down 20, 30 years down the road.
Okay, and so how do you assess the status of the fire department today?
Well, one of the things is that the status of the fire department is never a finite process, right? It's a constantly evolving task of looking at, what is our call volume? What are we doing? You look at our EMS versus fire percentage. I mean, we do roughly 68% of our calls are EMS, okay? We don't have house fires every day like some organizations that do. We do have them. They do occur. We do need to be prepared for them, but we don't have them every day. So, how does that change our training processes? A lot of that 68%, a lot of our EMS calls are falls. So how do we look at, is there a way we can prevent? How can we work with other organizations like the health department and the hospitals to do fall prevention? So we're constantly engaged with with other partners and agencies. We, obviously we can't do these things in a vacuum. So we work with other agencies, even like emergency management with Kenosha County, to make sure that we're prepared for larger events. Most of the time they're natural, tornadoes, floods, things like that. So as we look at the department today, we're also looking out, 5 years from now, saying, hey, what is our staffing going to look like? We have 8 spots today, and hopefully we fill those soon. But in 3-4 years, what might we need? 2 more people. How is the are the apparatus, fitting the appropriate need for what we're responding to? Someone asked me today during the construction, are you looking at electric vehicles, electric fire apparatuses? The city of Madison has the first fully electric pumper in the state. And, so I think for us that's a little farther out, but, again, the future remains to be seen. And, we look at the future, the current state and the future of the organization by just keeping in touch with other agencies, partners, seeing what other folks are doing, making sure that we're keeping abreast of different trends and things. So it's a never ending, and I tell my folks, and they know it pretty well, is that you're never done. You're never done learning. You're never done looking at what's out there. And, we hopefully we move that chess piece, as I call it, one square forward every day, knowing that there are days we're not going to move it forward. And we also know that some days we'll move them back a square. But the mission and the direction is to keep on moving those things forward. Because if you think everything's done, and there's nothing left to do, then it's probably time to retire.
What would you tell the residents of the village about the status of their fire service?
First and foremost, I think the village residents need to understand that they're getting great value for their dollar. We understand that taxing is a burden. We also understand that we need good equipment. We need to be able to respond in a timely manner. We need to be able to mitigate the problem in the shortest, most efficient way possible to minimize damage. As an example, I mean, if you have a fire in your bedroom or your kitchen and we can get there quickly and put that fire out, you may just have to replace a countertop or a dishwasher, okay? If I can't get there in a timely manner or with sufficient staff, you may not be able to return to your house at all. So in regards to the EMS side is that, unfortunately, the cost of things nowadays has just skyrocketed, and anybody that buys anything really, can understand that. Not that we need the best equipment, but we need the most appropriate equipment to be able to treat, and diagnose things that are going on today. And I'm very proud of the skill sets and the latitude that our medics can do in the field. In a lot of cases, there's many things that they do in the emergency room that we now do in the field. And we have a very good rapport with our medical director. They have very good confidence with our paramedics as far as what their capabilities are. So the idea of throwing them on the cot and rushing to the hospital as fast as humanly possible is long gone. If they need to get to a trauma center, we'll airlift them there because we know that that's the best definitive care for them. So I think, I invite all our residents to come down to the station, see what we have to offer, see what we're doing, ask questions, be inquisitive, because we have answers for probably pretty much all your questions. I can't forecast what somebody might ask, but we understand that the spending of dollars is very important, and we take that very seriously, and we don't spend the money frivolously.
Thank you for talking with me today.
My pleasure. I'm glad I had the opportunity. Thank you.